All right, so let's dive into something I think we've all experienced, right? Unsolicited advice. You know those moments when you're sharing something and they just jump in with their 2 cents, even though you didn't ask for it?
Oh, yeah, we've all been there. It can be more than a little annoying.
Exactly. It can be frustrating, confusing, even like a bit hurtful sometimes. So today, we're going to unpack all of this. Why people give unsolicited advice, what are the downsides, and of course, how can you deal with it gracefully?
Yeah, having a toolkit to deal with this stuff is really helpful.
Absolutely. One thing I found fascinating was one reason they do is that they can't handle silence. It's like they have to fill every gap, even with stuff you didn't ask for.
It's like a reflex, isn't it?
Mhm.
Silence, and they jump right in, even if it's totally off topic.
Right. So let's unpack this. Why offer this unsolicited advice in the first place?
Well, there's a few reasons, and most of the time, it's not malicious. They might genuinely think they're helping, like their knowledge is so valuable, even if it's not relevant to you.
This reminds me of when I was thinking of changing careers. A friend who'd had the same job forever lectured me about stability and steady paychecks. Well intentioned, but totally missed what I was looking for.
Classic example. I know stuff, therefore I must share. Frustrating for you, but they think they're being helpful.
Okay, so one reason thinking they're helpful. What else?
Sometimes it's ego, needing to be the expert. They give advice to feel dominant, secure in their knowledge.
So less about you, more about their validation.
Exactly. And it helps to remember that. When it's about their ego, they might not be trying to help you at all.
And this ties into another reason, projecting their fears. They warn you about dangers that aren't even relevant because it's what they fear.
Right. And this can be damaging, chipping away at your confidence.
Mhm.
Someone who always played it safe, warning you against risks, even if you're prepared.
It's like, don't do what I didn't, even if you want to. Which leads to another reason, seeking validation. They offer advice to reinforce their own choices.
Yeah. It's like, if you do what I did, then I was right.
It's amazing how their motivation shapes the advice, isn't it?
Absolutely. And being aware of it helps you navigate these situations.
Okay, so we got a few. They think they're helping, they want to be the expert, projecting fears, seeking validation, and can't forget the silence fillers.
Right. Those who can't stand a quiet moment, gotta fill it, even with opinions you didn't ask for. Research says it's discomfort with introspection or fear of being boring.
So again, not about you, it's their anxieties.
Exactly. And once you see that, it's easier to detach from their advice and not take it personally.
Really helpful perspective. We've delved into the why behind unsolicited advice, but before we get to downsides and strategies, gotta acknowledge, not all of it's bad.
Totally agree. Sometimes an outside perspective, even unasked for, can be helpful.
Right. So how do we know what to consider and what to just let slide?
That's where things get interesting. And that's what we'll be exploring next. The downsides and the strategies for sifting through it all and deciding what to take and what to leave behind. So we've talked about why people give this unsolicited advice, right? Sometimes they think they're helping, sometimes it's ego, sometimes fear, sometimes just validating their own choices. But let's flip it. Look at the impact on the person receiving it. It can be more than just annoying.
Yeah, it can be. I think people underestimate how much it can affect them, especially over time.
One big downside is it chips away at your confidence. When you're constantly getting advice, it says, hey, you can't figure things out yourself.
And then you start doubting yourself, even where you're usually good.
Exactly. And worse if it's from someone you respect, like a mentor or family. Their words hit harder, even if they don't mean to be hurtful.
So what do you do? How do you rebuild that confidence when it's been chipped away like that?
One powerful thing is focus on past successes. Remind yourself of good decisions, goals you achieved, challenges you overcame. It's easy to dwell on the negative, but remembering your wins, huge confidence boost.
Makes sense. Shifting focus to the positive counteracts that negative self-talk advice can trigger.
Absolutely. And surrounding yourself with people who believe in you, who support you, encourage you, not just give opinions.
That support system is so important when you're feeling bombarded by advice.
It really is. Having those cheerleaders makes a world of difference. And speaking of feeling bombarded, unsolicited advice can be mentally draining.
Oh, yeah. We talk about efficient learning, avoiding information overload, and unsolicited advice is a huge contributor to that.
You got it. Bombarded with opinions you didn't ask for, you spend time and energy processing them, even if you don't agree or plan to act on them.
Like mental clutter, all these opinions taking up space that could be used for something better. And that leads to decision fatigue, harder to focus on what matters.
Exactly. That's where boundaries are key. You have the right to protect your mental space. Limit exposure to what's not serving you. Not selfish, self-preservation.
Being mindful of what you let in, right? Creating space to think clearly and make decisions aligned with your values. But there's another downside, even more problematic. It can lead to bad
All
decisions.
right, not all advice is good advice. Blindly following everything, you might make choices that aren't right for you.
And that can have serious consequences, personally, professionally. Pursuing a path you're not passionate about, or risky financial decisions.
The person giving advice might not see the whole picture, or they're projecting their own biases and experiences onto you.
So even with good intentions, it might not be best for you.
Exactly. That's why critical thinking is crucial, evaluating advice objectively and making decisions that truly align with your goals and values. But beyond practical downsides, there's the emotional impact. Unsolicited advice can feel disrespectful.
Like they don't trust you to handle things. You're not smart enough, experienced enough, capable enough to figure this out.
And that's frustrating and hurtful. Undermining your autonomy, ability to make your own choices.
Okay, covered a lot. Unsolicited advice can damage confidence, drain energy, lead to bad decisions, and make you feel disrespected. But now, what you came for, the strategies, how to deal with this and preserve your sanity A&D relationships.
That's where things get empowering. Once you get the psychology and downsides, you can build a toolkit to navigate this stuff effectively.
It's about taking control, setting boundaries. So let's dive in.
First one, deceptively simple but powerful. Listen without reacting. Don't get defensive or shut down. Take a moment to hear them out.
Hard to do, especially when it feels personal or triggers insecurities.
Definitely takes practice. Key is detach from the emotion. Assess it objectively. Doesn't mean you agree or validate it, just creating space for calm processing.
Stepping back, seeing it from a neutral place.
Exactly. And remember, it might not even be about you. They could be projecting fears, validating their choices, filling silence because they're uncomfortable.
So you listen.
Yeah.
Then what? What's next in this dance?
Setting boundaries can be tough for some. Don't want to offend or damage the relationship.
That balance, assertive but compassionate.
Exactly. But boundaries aren't about being rude or dismissive. It's communicating your needs clearly and respectfully.
How do you do that? Phrases to use without being harsh or uncaring.
A few approaches? Depends on the situation. One is acknowledge their intention, but assert your autonomy. Like, I appreciate the input, but I'll figure this out on my own for now.
Good one. Not rejecting them outright, but clear that you make your own decisions.
Exactly. If they're persistent, be more direct. Thanks, but I'm confident in my decision, or I'll ask if I need advice.
Great examples. Key is consistency. Enforce those boundaries. They'll respect them.
Absolutely. But even with boundaries, you'll still get unsolicited advice. That's where trusting your judgment comes in.
So important. You know yourself best.
You're the expert on your life. You know your values, goals, strengths, weaknesses.
And you have the right to decide based on what's best for you, even if it goes against their advice.
Exactly. If you doubt yourself, seek advice from trusted mentors, advisors who know you well and have your best interests in mind.
But even then, you have the final say. Which advice resonates? Which to disregard? Taking ownership of your decisions, your life.
Exactly. But let's be real. Sometimes listening and boundaries aren't enough. You need to steer the conversation.
So what do you do when they keep giving advice, even after you've said you don't want it?
Redirecting the conversation. Instead of debating the advice, shift focus to their experiences.
Instead of arguing about what you should do, you ask about what they did.
Right. Interesting perspective. What made you decide that? Or, curious about your experience. What challenges did you face, and how did you overcome them?
Turning the tables a bit.
In a way, yes, but not confrontational. Genuinely shifting focus from you to them.
And you get more info, understanding where the advice comes from to decide if it's relevant.
Exactly. You might find it's based on old info or biases. Or you gain some valuable insights.
Turning a frustrating thing into learning and connection.
Exactly. Sometimes that diffuses the tension, moves things in a positive direction. But honestly, sometimes even that doesn't work. They're just relentless.
So then what? The nuclear option.
Disengaging. Sometimes the best thing is to walk away.
Isn't that rude, especially if you care about them?
It can feel like it, but you have the right to protect yourself. If they're repeatedly crossing boundaries, disrespecting you, it's okay to remove yourself.
No obligation to take negativity, even from someone you love.
Exactly. Sometimes walking away or changing the subject is the best way to say, I'm not interested. But before we wrap up, remember, not all unsolicited advice is bad.
Right. Sometimes an outside perspective can be really valuable, even if we didn't ask for it.
So when do you consider it, and when do you let it go?
$1 million question.
Yeah,
Right.
it is. Not always easy. One framework is 3 criteria: experience, objectivity, and alignment. Is the advice from someone experienced in that area? Is it objective or biased? And does it align with your long-term goals and values?
Helpful guidelines. So, your tech-savvy friend giving gadget advice, worth listening to. But your friend who's never left the country telling you how to plan a Europe trip, maybe not so much.
Exactly. Using discernment, evaluating the source, and if it resonates with you and your vision.
And even if you consider it, you filter it through your judgment, decisions based on what feels right.
You always have the final say. Which brings us to the last part of our deep dive, the outro, where we leave you with some final thoughts on this wonderfully weird world of unsolicited advice.
So we've covered a lot, right? The motivations behind this unsolicited advice, the downsides, and of course, how to handle it all.
We talked about listening without reacting, setting boundaries, trusting your judgment, even redirecting the conversation or just walking away, and finding those rare bits of advice that are actually helpful.
It's all about, taking control, protecting your mental space, and making choices that are right for you. But before we wrap up, any final thoughts? What's the one thing you hope listeners take away from this?
That's a good one. We've talked about how to deflect or avoid this advice, right? But what if, instead of seeing it as a problem, we see it as like an opportunity?
I like that. An opportunity, not a problem. Tell me more.
What if it's a chance to practice setting boundaries, to get better at communication, or even just like observe human behavior with curiosity, maybe even compassion?
That's a powerful shift, taking away the sting and turning it into something positive for you.
Right. Because often it's more about them, the advice giver, than you. It shows their insecurities, their biases, their need to be right.
Like a window into them. And once you see that, you can detach from the emotion and react in a way that helps both of you.
Exactly. So instead of getting defensive, we can be curious, willing to learn, even if it's just about human nature.
And maybe, just maybe, we can turn these frustrating things into moments of real connection.
Wouldn't that be something? Taking something negative and making it positive, connecting with people.
I think that's perfect to end on. So listeners, out there in the world of advice, asked for or not, trust your gut, set those boundaries, and approach everything with an open mind, a bit of compassion.
And never underestimate that power perspective, right? You might be surprised what you find.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of unsolicited advice. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, keep diving deep.